One of the most critical scenes of the Two Towers film is the Uruk-hai's night camp at Fangorn and the attack of the riders of Rohan. In this short scene, we finally get a taste for the personalities and politics of the Uruk-hai of Isengard and the Orcs of Mordor. Plus, it sets up the crucial plotline of Merry and Pippin's escape into Fangorn Forest. But what if I told you that this scene is a Frankenstein combination of multiple parts of Tolkien's original story? The surprise attack by Rohan? Well, it wasn't much of a surprise. The orcs fighting over the hobbits? That happens days earlier, not at the edge of Fangorn as shown in the movie. And maybe the most crazy change of all, the orcs never tried to eat Merry and Pippin, but rather Grishnak's interest in them was much more sinister. Needless to say, meat was never back on the menu. Sorry, boys. My name is Gibby, and welcome back to episode 22 of Movies vs. Manuscripts Lord of the Rings edition. This is a show where I analyze Peter Jackson's Lord of the Rings, scene by scene, and compare it to Tolkien's original series to find every single difference. Today, we are covering the Orcs' night camp at Fangorn Forest and Merry and Pippin's fate at the hands of Grishnak, the Orc commander from Mordor. At least, that's what he's supposed to be in Tolkien's version. You see, in Peter Jackson's adaptation, the Uruk-hai aren't the only ones who got changed, but today we are diving into all the differences between the book and the movie in regard to how Grishnak, the esteemed commander, handled Merry and Pippin, as well as the disagreement between the Uruk-hai and the Orcs, and then finally the attack from the Rohirrim. However, before we jump into that, shout out to this commenter. Every week I'll be highlighting one of my favorite comments from a previous episode, so be sure to comment your thoughts down below when you're done watching this video. Also, according to YouTube, 95% of you aren't even subscribed, so hit that sub button and stay tuned each Saturday as new episodes come out. As always, I'll cover these changes across the 4 categories of characters, timeline, location, and plot. But before we jump into the changes, let's refresh our memory on what happens during this scene in the movie. Today, it's a quick one, but trust me, there's a whole lot of analysis on the back end. Picking up from where we left off last week, with our 3 hunters on the trail of the Uruk-hai, we cut to the pack of orcs stopping for a breather at the edge of Fangorn Forest. Ugluk, the Uruk-hai captain, shouts at them to get a fire going, and we see them chopping away at the edge of the trees. Pippin scoots closer to Merry to see if he's alright, and they both hear the trees groaning as they speak to each other. Merry tells Pippin that he had heard stories from back home about trees coming alive in the old forest. We then see an Uruk-hai getting upset over his maggoty bread as he says he's starving, and then an orc chimes in and says that he wants some meats as he stares at Merry and Pippin. Thankfully for Merry and Pippin, Ugluk steps in and tells them that they are off limits. But the orc leader steps up and suggests their legs, as they don't need those. Ugluk then has his Uruks drag off Merry and Pippin and guard them as he informs the orcs that they are meant to be kept alive and unspoiled. The orc presses further and asks why alive, and Ugluk says that they have something the master wants, an elvish weapon. Merry and Pippin realize the orcs think that they have the ring, but they keep quiet about it as an orc sneaks up behind them. Once again, Ugluk to the rescue as he lops off the head of the orc that's about to grab the halflings, and then he shouts at his Uruks that meat is back on the menu. Then we see them all diving onto the dead orc body. While the group of orcs and Uruk-hai are distracted, Merry and Pippin crawl away and try to escape, but unfortunately, Grishnak, the orc leader from earlier, steps on them. However, right as he is about to stab them, he gets impaled, and suddenly a host of horses run into frame and attack the encampment, slaughtering all of the orcs in sight. The scene then ends with a horse coming straight down onto Pippin and the screen going black. And that's all we're going to cover for this week. When I was doing research for this episode, I went forward with the next couple of scenes of our 3 hunters meeting Eomer and then them tracking Merry and Pippin into Fangorn, but there were so many changes and so much conversation between them and Eomer that I had to separate these into 2 different episodes. So this week we'll be covering this night camp scene, and next week we'll get into Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli's meeting with Eomer and their discovery of Merry and Pippin's fate. Per usual, before we jump into plot changes, let's cover our character, timeline, and location differences. The good news is that because this is a shorter scene, our timeline and location categories get a pass. There's only one slight location difference, but we mentioned it last week and it has way more to do with the plot, so we'll cover it again in that section. As for our character differences, we only have one. Although it's arguable that he is shown but not named, Lugdush is an Uruk-hai lieutenant who is set to guard the captives, but we'll get to that in a bit. If you've been watching this series, this makes sense as Tolkien always did a great job of rounding out his world with character names, even for the people you barely know, and he treated the Uruk-hai no different. In fact, next week there's going to be another Uruk named in the book who we never meet in the movie, but that change is a lot more in depth, so make sure to stay tuned next week for that update. Alright, now that we've covered those first 3 categories, let's head into the plot changes. As always, I can't cover every single line of dialogue, so if you want to dive deeper into Tolkien's writings, check out the link in my description to claim your free Audible trial and get up to 2 free audiobooks. That way you can dive into the world of Middle-earth in a whole new way, and it supports the channel at the same time. Now let's jump into the plot changes. So our first few changes for the scene will need to be covering some more general items that don't directly get shown in Peter Jackson's version. First, it's important to remember that at this point, they are not at the edge of Fangorn like in the movie. They're on a hillock about 3 furlongs out from Fangorn, according to Pippin. What happens in the book, and where we left off last time we checked in on Merry and Pippin, was when Ugluk sets the prisoners at the center of their camp as they're surrounded by the riders of Rohan. He appoints Lugdush, one of our missing characters, to grab a couple of other Urks and guard the captives. He tells them to bind their legs as he doesn't want them to escape. This plays into another small change, which is that in the movie, I never saw their legs bound. In the book, the only reason they have the hope of escaping is because of Pippin's quick thinking earlier on in their journey. If you recall from a couple episodes ago when we covered the Uruk-hai's traveling with our 2 hobbits, at one point Pippin quickly cut the rope around his hands and then replaced them with loose knots. Of course, we'll get to their escape in next week's episode, but if you aren't caught up, be sure to go back and watch episode 20 of the series to learn more about that situation. But for today, just know that in the book they are fully bound, whereas in the movie it's only their hands. Next, we have a change that is pretty big for the overall narrative. You see, in the book, the Uruk-hai are fully aware that they're surrounded. In the movie, as we'll see in a moment, there is an attack in which the riders of Rohan take the encampment by surprise. The only reason they stopped at the edge of the forest in Peter Jackson's version is because they need a breather, but in the book, they stop out of necessity as they are completely surrounded. As the Uruk-hai set up their camp, they watch as little fires spring up around them. Quick fun fact, by the way, is that the lighting of many fires around the Uruk-hai was a strategic play from Eomer, as this would trick their enemies into thinking that there were many more riders than there actually were. Anyway, Tolkien writes that they were within bowshot, but the men of Rohan stayed away from the light of the fires, so the Orcs and Uruk-hai kept missing their shots until Ugluk told them to stop blindly shooting into the night. At this point, it's just a waiting game, as Ugluk prepares for the inevitable battle to come. Now before we get to the disagreement we see in the scene, and then the attack from the riders of Rohan, there's one more change that plays a larger role later on during Merry and Pippin's escape. Technically, it has more to do with next week's episode, but I wanted to include it now as it is briefly brought up by Merry and Pippin as they're sitting and waiting for the attack. This change is that in the book, Merry and Pippin still have some lembas with them. Here's what happens. Merry and Pippin are starving, and then Pippin remembers that they have lembas bread in their pockets, and that the Uruk-hai have not searched them yet on strict orders from Ugluk. Merry says the lembas is surely crushed, and then notes that he can't reach it anyway as his hands are bound. But as Pippin is about to tell him that his hands are actually free, an Uruk-hai kicks him, which informs him that things have quieted down and the Uruks can now hear them talking to each other. For now, this is all we hear of the lembas, but it will come into play later on as our 3 hunters track and solve the riddle of the halfling's escape. Plus, in the movie, they have nothing to eat for ages, whereas in the book, in typical Hobbit fashion, they've got food on the brain even in a life or death situation. Okay, so now that we've set the scene and you have a feel for what the setup was like in Tolkien's version, let's go to Peter Jackson's version and see what was changed. First, we have a small change, which is that Merry and Pippin don't discuss the trees talking to each other like they show at the beginning of this scene. Obviously, as I have already mentioned, they are several hundred yards away from the forest still, and the Uruks don't chop the trees down to start fires, so they never hear the trees talking to each other. Of course, this is just Peter Jackson's way of setting up their future plotline with Treebeard, as well as paying homage to some of the chapters he cut out about the Old Forest and the Fellowship of the Ring. But this dialogue is not in Tolkien's version. Next, we have a much larger change, which is that the Orcs don't try to eat the hobbits. This is the primary focus of this scene in the film, as Ugluk and his Uruk-hai defend the hobbits from the bloodthirsty Orcs. But in the book, this never happens. However, like I said at the beginning of this video, this scene is a mixture of the night camp near Fangorn and a previous moment in this chapter. You see, if you remember from our previous episode about the Uruk-hai, the Orcs wanted to torture and kill the hobbits, and Ugluk says that they cannot. However, it really is the commanders versus the grunts, as there are orcs and uruks on both sides that want the hobbits dead. In Tolkien's writings, it is Ugluk and Grishnak, the orc captain, who hold firm to the order of bringing the prisoners in unspoiled. This causes a disagreement amongst the 3 breeds of orcs, and to establish who is in charge, Ugluk lops off a few orc heads. That is where I'm guessing Peter Jackson got the inspiration for this part of the scene, as Ugluk beheads the orc that tries to sneak up on Merry and Pippin and eat them. Which brings me to a depressing next change. Ugluk never says, "Meat's back on the menu, boys." I know, I was heartbroken about this too. Anyway, on a more serious note, the whole narrative of the orcs trying to eat the hobbits brings on a much larger difference, which is the portrayal of Grishnak, the orc captain. You see, Grishnak was in direct communication with a Nazgul, and had strict orders to bring the halflings to Mordor. In Tolkien's chapter about the orcs' journey from Amon Hen to Fangorn, Grishnak is very involved. He is there at Amon Hen when they capture the halflings, and he communicates with the Nazgul to instruct Ugluk to bring the hobbits to Lugburts, an outpost of Sauron. After the disagreement in which Ugluk chops off a few orc heads, Grishnak slips off and meets back up with the Nazgul, who instructs him once again to follow Ugluk and make sure to get the prisoners and not let them go to Saruman. Needless to say, this orc captain was pretty high up and trusted to carry out the orders he was given. However, in the movie, Grishnak quickly gives up his orders as soon as he gets hungry, as he tries to eat Merry and Pippin. This never happens in the book, and it goes completely against Grishnak's character. As I mentioned in a previous change, Grishnak sided with Ugluk when the other orcs wanted to kill the halflings, as Grishnak also had orders to keep them unspoiled. But in the movie, he says they don't need their legs? It just doesn't line up, and I kind of wish they allowed Grishnak to keep his role as it was in the book. Now, all of that being said, Peter Jackson sort of got inspiration from Tolkien's writings for this plot point, as Grishnak does have a one-on-one moment with the hobbits later on, but in a much different way. Now, before we head into the final change, which has to do with Grishnak's near escape with Merry and Pippin, I want to mention again that episode 20 of the series has a lot to do with today's episode, as they actually are the same chapter in Tolkien's book. I had to put them a little out of order for this series, as Peter Jackson jumps around for his adapted version. But if you're feeling like you're missing some context, please go and check out episode 20 from a couple weeks ago, which I'll link in the video description. This will help fill you in on a lot more details about the Uruk-hai and Orcs as they transport Merry and Pippin to Fangorn. Alright, so let's finish up with the finale of the Uruk-hai's final stand against the Riders of Rohan, and Grishnak's near escape with the prisoners. Peter Jackson does show his version of this in the film, but in the book, they don't get cornered by Grishnak as he tries to eat them. However, they do have a conversation with him, which leads to their eventual escape. So here's what happens in the book. As the Riders of Rohan slowly pick off the Orcs and Uruks at the edge of the encampment, Ugluk is struggling to keep his people in line, as they are hungry to just go attack the men. After they hear some commotion a little ways off as some Orcs get slaughtered, Ugluk runs off to keep the other Orcs from charging forward for an attack, and when he runs off, Merry and Pippin's bodyguards run off with him. This leaves them completely unguarded, which they see as their opportunity to escape. Unfortunately for them, there is still one person in their way, and that is of course, Grishnak. Soon after the Isengarders leave to stop the stampede, Grishnak grabs the halflings by their necks and gets so close to them that they can feel his breath. He begins pawing at them and feeling around their garments, and Pippin quickly realizes that he's searching for the ring. Quick on his feet, he starts to act like Gollum, even coughing like Gollum a few times for good measure, and this seems to do the trick for Grishnak. Merry and Pippin then try to negotiate with Grishnak, saying that they'll show him what he's looking for if he cuts the rope around their legs. Grishnak holds strong for a little bit, saying that they'll be searched and questioned when they get to Mordor, and I was briefly impressed by this as he is still following orders and not wanting to take the ring for himself. But the hobbits eventually do find the right nerve to strike, as they say that Ugluk is taking them to Isengard and Saruman, and upon mentioning the name of Saruman, Grishnak is officially triggered. Again, this relates back to episode 20. If you recall from that episode, you'll know that Grishnak previously called Saruman a fool, and he knows that if the ring gets to Saruman first, he will be in big trouble, as he was strictly instructed to bring the hobbits to the Nazgul at Lugburts. At the mention of Saruman, Grishnak grabs the hobbits and runs off with them towards the forest, where he says he will cut them into pieces and find the item they're hiding. It is important to note that Grishnak doesn't know the elvish weapon is a ring, but he does think that they have something. Unfortunately for him, this plan is his undoing, as the glint and sound of his blade draws attention from the nearby Riders of Rohan, and as he raises his hand to stab Merry and Pippin, he quickly gets shot with an arrow in the hand, and then soon after, he is chased down by riders and killed. But where are Merry and Pippin? Well, as they're still bound, they weren't able to run off. However, the Lothlorien cloaks around them protected them from the men as they couldn't see them in the dark, and therefore they weren't speared like the rest of the orcs. For now, we'll leave our two hobbits right there, sitting somewhere between the Uruk-hai encampment and the edge of Fangorn still a ways off, bound and hungry. And that's where we'll leave it off for this week. Once again, we're on a cliffhanger, and I can't wait to do next week's episode. But for now, I want to hear from you. Do you like Peter Jackson's version of the scene, or do you wish Grishnak and the Uruk-hai would have stayed true to Tolkien's version? As always, be sure to go back and check out the entire series playlist to catch up on any episodes you might have missed so far, and like and subscribe and stay tuned if you're new to the channel. Have a great week, and I'll see you in the next episode.